Welcome back to Read Aloud with me, Dan Simpson, a.k.a. Commie Knoxville, a.k.a. Hammer Dan Sickle Pants. All right, whatever. We're going to read from Chapter 2 of Stalin's Marxism and the National Question, and I'm happy to be with you today. If you like my content, feel free to support. You can subscribe on Twitch, you can support on Patreon, or send a tip. Let's get into Chapter 2 of Marxism and the National Question. Chapter 2, the National Movement. Yes, I'm not actually from Knoxville. I don't even think I've ever been. Chapter 2. This is a good one. Chapter 2. A nation is not merely a historical category, but a historical category belonging to a definite epoch. The epoch of rising capitalism. The process of elimination of feudalism and development of capitalism is at the same time a process of the constitution of people into nations. Oh, okay. So it's like a post-feudalism thing. Such, for instance, was the case in Western Europe. The British, French, Germans, Italians, and others were formed into nations at the time of the victorious advance of capitalism and its triumph over feudal disunity. But the formation of nations in those instances at the same time signified their conversion into independent national states. The British, French, and other nations are at the same time British, etc., states. Ireland, which did not participate in this process, does not alter the general picture. So they form into nations, and then they form into national states after feudalism. Okay. Matters proceeded somewhat differently in Eastern Europe. Whereas in the West, nations developed into states, in the East, multinational states were formed. States consisting of several nationalities. Such are Austria, Hungary, and Russia. In Austria, the Germans proved to be politically the most developed, and they took it upon themselves to unite the Austrian nationalities into a state. In Hungary, the most adapted for state organization were the Magyars, the core of the Hungarian nationalities, and it was they who united Hungary. Shout out to chatter Magyar guy. In Russia, the uniting of the nationalities was undertaken by the Great Russians, who were headed by a historically formed, powerful, and well-organized aristocratic military bureaucracy. That was how matters proceeded in the East. This special method of formation of states could take place only where feudalism had not yet been eliminated, where capitalism was feebly developed, where the nationalities had been forced into the background, had not yet been able to consolidate themselves economically into integral nations. Nationalities forced into the background. But capitalism also began to develop in the eastern states. Trade and means of communication were developing. Large towns were springing up. Nations were becoming economically consolidated. Capitalism, erupting into the tranquil life of the nationalities which had been pushed into the background, was arousing them and stirring them into action. The development of the press and the theater, the activity of the Reichsrat in Austria and the Duma in Russia, were helping to strengthen national sentiments. The intelligentsia that had arisen, was being imbued with the national idea and was acting in the same direction. Intelligentsia imbued with the national idea. Isn't that like a button in the game Victoria 3? It's like a thing you can get your anyways. But the nations which had been pushed into the background had now awakened to independent life. Uh-oh. And they could no longer form themselves into independent national states. Oh shit, what are we going to do now? They encountered on their path the very powerful resistance of the ruling strata of the dominant nations, which had long ago assumed the control of the state. They were too late. This sucks. What are we going to do here? How are we going to solve this problem? This national question? In this way, the Czechs, Poles, etc., formed themselves into nations in Austria, the Croats, etc., in Hungary, the Lets, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, etc., in Russia. What had been an exception in Western Europe, Ireland, became the rule in the East. In the West, Ireland responded to this exceptional position by a national movement. In the East, the awakened nations were bound to respond in the same fashion. Thus arose the circumstances which impelled the young nations of Eastern Europe onto the path of struggle. The struggle began and flared up, to be sure, not between nations as a whole, but between the ruling classes of the dominant nations and of those that had been pushed into the background. Between the ruling classes of the dominant nation and the weaker, awakening nation. They're bourgeoisies. They're ruling classes fighting. It's not their nations yet fighting each other. The struggle is usually conducted by the urban petty bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation against the big bourgeoisie of the dominant nation, such as the Czechs and Germans, or by the rural bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation against the landlords of the dominant nation, Ukrainians in Poland, or by the whole national bourgeoisie of the oppressed nations against the ruling nobility of the dominant nation, Poland, Lithuania, and the Ukraine in Russia. The bourgeoisie plays the leading role. The chief problem for the young bourgeoisie, the weaker awakening nation bourgeoisie, is the problem of the market. Its aim is to sell its goods and to emerge victorious from competition with the bourgeoisie of a different nationality. Hence its desire to secure its home market. The market is the first school in which the bourgeoisie learns its nationalism. It's where they cut their teeth. That's where their nationalism, that's why this nationalism often takes on a certain character, a bourgeois character. But matters are usually not confined to the market. The semi-feudal, semi-bourgeois bureaucracy of the dominant nation intervenes in the struggle with its own methods of arresting and preventing. The bourgeoisie, whether big or small, of the dominant nation, is able to deal more swiftly and decisively with its competitor. Forces are united and a series of restrictive measures is put into operation against the alien bourgeoisie, measures passing into acts of repression. The struggle spreads from the economic sphere to the political sphere. Restriction of freedom of movement, repression of language, restriction of franchise, closing of schools, religious restrictions, and so on, are piled upon the head of the competitor. Of course, such measures are designed not only in the interest of the bourgeois classes of the dominant nation, but also in the furtherance of the specifically cast aims, so to speak, of the ruling bureaucracy. But from the point of view of the results achieved, this is quite immaterial. The bourgeois classes and the bureaucracy in this matter go hand in hand, whether it be in Austria-Hungary or in Russia. The bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation, repressed on every hand, is naturally stirred into movement. It appeals to its native folk and begins to shout about the fatherland, claiming that its own cause is the cause of the nation as a whole. It recruits itself an army from among its countrymen in the interests of the fatherland. Nor do the folk always remain unresponsive to its appeals. They rally around its banner. The repression from above affects them too and provokes their discontent. Thus, the national movement begins. This is just such a banger, right? The strength of the national movement is determined by the degree to which the wide strata of the nation, the proletariat and peasantry, participate in it. Whether the proletariat rallies to the banner of bourgeois nationalism depends on the degree of development of class antagonisms, on the class consciousness and degree of organization of the proletariat. The class-conscious proletariat has its own tried banner and has no need to rally the banner of the bourgeoisie. Has no need to rally to the banner of the bourgeoisie. As far as the peasants are concerned, their participation in the national movement depends primarily on the character of the repressions. If the repressions affect the land, as was the case in Ireland, then the mass of the peasants immediately rally to the banner of the national movement. On the other hand, if, for example, there is no serious anti-Russian nationalism in Georgia, it is primarily because there are neither Russian landlords nor a Russian big bourgeoisie there to supply the fuel for such nationalism among the masses. In Georgia, there is anti-Armenian nationalism, but this is because there's still an Armenian big bourgeoisie there, which, by getting the better of the small and still unconsolidated German bourgeoisie, by getting the better of the small and still unconsolidated Georgian bourgeoisie, drives the latter to anti-Armenian nationalism. Depending on these factors, the national movement either assumes a mass character and steadily grows, as in Ireland and Galicia, or is converted into a series of petty collisions, degenerating into squabbles and fights over signboards, as in some of the small towns of Bohemia. The content of the national movement, of course, cannot everywhere be the same. It is wholly determined by the diverse demands made by the movement. In Ireland, the movement bears an agrarian character. In Bohemia, it bears a language character. In one place, the demand is for civil equality and religious freedom. In another, for the nation's own officials or its own diet. Or diet? I tried to look this word up and I didn't get anything. I'm assuming it means its own area, its own territory. What does that mean? I assume territory. Okay. The diversity of demands, not infrequently. It's like a parliament. Oh, okay. Japan has is it diet or diet? It's really weird. Okay, you're saying Japan has one? Okay. Reading on. Thank you. Thank you, chat. The diversity of demands not infrequently reveals the diverse features which characterize a nation in general, language, territory, etc. It is worthy of note that we never meet with a demand based on Bauer's all-embracing national character. He brings him back. Bauer lives in Stalin's head rent-free. Daietolo. Daieto. No one knows. They call it both. Wow. Okay. Um, and reading on here, and this is natural. National character in itself is something intangible, and as was correctly remarked by J. Strasser, a politician can't do anything with it. Diet. Is that how you're going to say it? Okay. Stalin says, such, in general, are the forms and character of the national movement. From what has been said, it will be clear that the national struggle under the conditions of rising capitalism is a struggle of the bourgeois classes among themselves. Sometimes the bourgeoisie succeeds in drawing the proletariat into the national movement, and then the national struggle externally assumes a nationwide character. But this is so only externally. In its essence, it is always a bourgeois struggle, one that is to the advantage and profit mainly of the bourgeoisie. But it does not by any means follow that the proletariat should not put up a fight against the policy of national oppression. Restriction of freedom of movement, disenfranchisement, repression of language, closing of schools, and other forms of persecution affect the workers no less, if not more, than the bourgeoisie. Such a state of affairs only served to retard the free development of the intellectual forces of the proletariat of subject nations. One cannot speak seriously of a full development of the intellectual faculties of the Tatar or Jewish worker if he's not allowed to use his native language at meetings and lectures, and if his schools are shut down. The policy of nationalist persecution is dangerous to the cause of the proletariat also on another account. It diverts the attention of large strata from social questions, questions of the class struggle, to national questions, questions common to the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And this creates a favorable soil for lying propaganda about harmony of interests, for glossing over the class interests of the proletariat, and for the intellectual enslavement of the workers. This creates a serious obstacle to the cause of uniting the workers of all nationalities. If a considerable proportion of the Polish workers are still in intellectual bondage to the bourgeois nationalists, if they still stand aloof from the international labor movement, it is chiefly because the age-old anti-Polish policy of the powers that be creates the soil for this bondage and hinders the emancipation of the workers from it. But the policy of persecution does not stop there. it not infrequently passes from a system of oppression to a system of inciting nations against each other to a system of massacres and pogroms. Of course, the latter system is not everywhere and always possible, but where it is possible, in the absence of elementary civil rights, it frequently assumes horrifying proportions and threatens to drown the cause of unity of the workers in blood and tears. The Caucasus and South Russia furnish numerous examples. That was a mistake. I did not mean to hit that button. Divide and rule. One second. Okay. Again, divide and rule. Such is the purpose of the policy of incitement. And where such a policy succeeds, it is a tremendous evil for the proletariat and a serious obstacle to the cause of uniting the workers of all the nationalities in the state. Again, yeah, absolutely. A century on, this is so meaningful. This is still very meaningful. Stalin says, but the workers are interested in the complete amalgamation of all their fellow workers into a single international army, in their speedy and final emancipation from intellectual bondage to the bourgeoisie, and in the full and free development of the intellectual forces of their brothers, whatever nation they may belong to. The workers therefore combat and will continue to combat the policy of national oppression in all its forms, from the most subtle to the most crude, as well as the policy of inciting nations against each other in all its forms. I'm always struck reading Stalin and Lenin that Western leaders never speak with such clarity. It's despicable. Stalin says, social democracy in all countries therefore proclaims the right of nations to self-determination. All-time banger. The right of self-determination means that only the nation itself has the right to determine its destiny. That no one has the right forcibly to interfere in the life of the nation, to destroy its schools and other institutions, to violate its habits and customs, to repress its language or curtail its rights. This, of course, does not mean that social democracy will support every custom and institution of a nation. While combating the coercion of any nation, it will uphold the right of the nation itself to determine its own destiny. At the same time, agitating against harmful customs and institutions of that nation in order to enable the toiling strata of the nation to emancipate themselves from them. They'll support your right to do something, but that doesn't necessarily mean they support that thing that you do. They will fight against it if they have to. But they will defend your right to do that thing, to have the ability to do the thing. Reading on. The right of self-determination means that a nation may arrange its life in the way it wishes. It has the right to arrange its life on the basis of autonomy. It has the right to enter into federal relations with other nations. It has the right to complete secession. Nations are sovereign, and all nations have equal rights. You'll notice he doesn't say all states have equal rights or all states have a right to exist as a state with equal rights or some stupid shit like that. That's what liberals say. This, of course, Stalin says, this, of course, does not mean that social democracy will support every demand of a nation. A nation has the right even to return to the old order of things, but this does not mean that social democracy will subscribe to such a decision if taken by some institution of a particular nation. The obligations of social democracy, which defends the interests of the proletariat, and the rights of a nation, which consists of various classes, are two different things. In fighting for the right of nations to self-determination, the aim of social democracy is to put an end to the policy of national oppression, to render it impossible, and thereby to remove the grounds of strife between nations, to take the edge off that strife and reduce it to a minimum. This is what essentially distinguishes the policy of the class-conscious proletariat from the policy of the bourgeoisie, which attempts to aggravate and fan the national struggle and to prolong and sharpen the national movement. And that is why the class-conscious proletariat cannot rally under the national flag of the bourgeoisie. That is why the so-called evolutionary national policy advocated by Bauer cannot become the policy of the proletariat. Bauer's attempts to identify his evolutionary national policy with the policy of the modern working class is an attempt to adapt the class struggle of the workers to the struggle of the nations. The fate of a national movement, which is essentially a bourgeois movement, is naturally bound up with the fate of the bourgeoisie. The final disappearance of a national movement is possible only with the downfall of the bourgeoisie. Only under the reign of socialism can peace be fully established. But even within the framework of capitalism, it is possible to reduce the national struggle to a minimum, to undermine it at the root, to render it as harmless as possible to the proletariat. This is borne out, for example, by Switzerland and America. Ooh. See what I mean? It requires that the country should be democratized and the nations be given the opportunity of free development. And that is just such a Eurocentric. It's just like, how are you missing this, Stalin? Bro, free development nations? What about First Nations, oppressed nations? They did a genocide. How do you gloss over? How do you not even mention it? I don't know. That's just that's a disappointing moment for me as I read Stalin. I mean, he's not wrong. Nations should be given the opportunity for free development, but America is not an example of that. You dummy. I don't get that. I don't get that. I don't get how he misses that. That's upsetting, Okay. And that is chapter 2, which generally is very good. I just think it reeks of Eurocentrism. But his point does stand about nations needing the opportunity for free development. But I also think that indigenous and First Nations should be included in that. Absolutely. This chapter's a banger. Let's do some review. Oh. All right.
Extra thick!
Welcome in, comrade. A nation is a historical category belonging to a definite epoch. It's related to a period of time, you guys. The epoch of capitalism, of rising capitalism. It's a sort of a post-feudalism thing, right? Formation of nations. And then you have them forming into states, some forming into multinational states, consisting of several nationalities. You can imagine as well nationalities developing more quickly than others, and they develop their state, and then unfortunately we have the issue of later development of nationalities. We have the issue of nationalities sort of coming and going and changing all the time. Thus, the national question. It's why this is an important question. We learn how the struggle between ruling classes of the dominant nations turns into the national struggle. And that's why the national struggle has a distinct bourgeois character, because they play the leading role. They learn to do this in the market. And the struggle spreads from the market to the political sphere. Repression. Sometimes the peasants and proletariat are convinced by the bourgeoisie to join in. That's when the national struggle is born. This policy of persecution passes from a system of oppression to a system of inciting nations against each other. That's no good. I don't like that. You heard all nationalism is bad. Yeah, well, we've covered that on this channel many times. And he gets right here to this banger. He just says it. Social democracy in all countries therefore proclaims the right of nations, to self-determination, has the right to determine its destiny, may arrange its life in the way it wishes. Maybe that means autonomy. Maybe that means entering into relations with other nations. It has the right to secede from a state, because nations are sovereign and all nations have equal rights. No nation has the right to oppress another nation. Nations that oppress other nations cannot be free. They will never be free. Only Palestine will be free. The aim of social democracy or communism or whatever is to put an end to the policy of national oppression. And only the reign of socialism can bring peace in this sense. The final, here it is. The fate of a national movement, which is essentially a bourgeois movement, is naturally tied up with the fate of the bourgeoisie. The final, come on, dude, let me fucking highlight this. The final disappearance of a national movement is possible only with the downfall of the bourgeoisie. Only under the reign of socialism can peace be fully established. He does say that even within capitalism, you can minimize the national struggle to undermine it. render it as harmless as possible to the proletariat. It says it requires a country be democratized and nations given the opportunity of free development. While he's not wrong about that, I think he gives us poor examples, at least one poor example. And that's chapter 2. And I hope you enjoyed reading that with me. If you did, feel free to support my content, like and subscribe, and catch me next time when we read chapter 3, the presentation of the question.